Hello and welcome to this discussion about NATO's next strategic concept, the document that lays out how the alliance should look to the future for the next 10 years. Thank you very much to our audience joining us from all over the world, those of you staying up late or getting up early to join us here at NATO's headquarters in Brussels. I'm Teri Schulz, a freelance journalist who's been covering NATO and the European Union security and defense policy for the last 15 years. And I'm very happy to have you with us, and we're going to be taking your questions throughout our 1-hour program. So go ahead and send those in on the chat function of your Zoom program. Joining me here at NATO headquarters, a very esteemed panel, starting with our new U.S. Ambassador, Julie Smith, who finally was able to take up her post at the ministerial in Riga, where, in fact, the official discussions on the strategic concept were launched. So it's been unavoidable for you from the get-go, right? You are steeped in this, Ambassador. And here on my left, Ian Lesser, Dr. Ian Lesser. He is the Vice President at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and also the Executive Director of the Brussels office, someone many of us here in Brussels turn to explain transatlantic relations. To his left, Tania Lațici. She is a policy officer at the European Union's External Action Service, which is the EU's foreign policy outreach service. She is also a fellow at CEPA and, key for this discussion, one of NATO's 2030 young leaders. She helped coordinate this group, looking to the leaders of the future for their ideas about where NATO should go next. And finally, Dr. Christian Moelling. He is from the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and he is also executive director of their security and defense program. Thank you very much for being with us, all of you. And because we only have an hour, we are going to get right into this. Now, coming from my own perspective here, I find it a little difficult to grasp how NATO can even chart its path for the next 10 years. This is very difficult to do with how quickly everything changes. And yet the Alliance feels this is very important. So we're going to hear from our speakers today how they're going to do that, what needs to be in this 10-year plan, and how you manage to find things that feel responsive today and also will feel responsive in a decade. And from the last strategic concept, which I reviewed to get ready for this panel, famously, we've discussed it a lot here in this building, China wasn't even mentioned, and yet today NATO, along with many other world bodies, consider China a priority. And so this next strategic concept is going to have to really look at that. Now, with the world increasingly unpredictable, hybrid attacks change every day, cyber attacks every minute, how can you stay ahead of those? How can this document prepare the alliance in any way for something that is so rapidly changing? That's something we're going to talk about here today. U.S. military resourcing, the challenges that we're facing today with Russia, it didn't look like that a decade ago. And so now the ambassador gets to start. Ambassador Smith, we today are facing a challenge, the world and certainly here at NATO, that was not predicted 10 years ago when people were considerably more optimistic about the U.S.-Russian relationship. And so if you could give us a quick status check, because I know all my journalist friends out there are expecting this of me and of you, on what is happening today. We've got the Minsk talks going on today. A letter is going out to Moscow from both the U.S. and from NATO within the coming days. Where are we today? And then how do you use what's happening today? How do you read into what's happening today something that is still going to make sense, something that is still going to be useful 10 years from now?
Well, thank you, Teri. Thanks for hosting this discussion. Thanks to the German Marshall Fund. So good to actually see people in person. I really hadn't been over to Europe in quite some time until I assumed this post. So it's wonderful to be able to do things like this and also pull in so many people virtually. So in terms of what's happening right now, I mean, it's pretty clear what the current plan is. And just to reiterate that, first and foremost, what we're trying to do is to send a signal to Moscow that the NATO alliance here in Brussels is prepared for dialogue. We already had a NATO-Russia Council. Excuse me, it was the first time in 2 years that we were able to hold such a session. And so our goal is de-escalation and diplomacy. Simultaneously, the allies are focused on making sure that Russia understands that should they choose another path, the alliance is prepared for all contingencies, that we are prepared to impose massive consequences on Russia if they choose the path of conflict. And we will do what we need to do to enhance deterrence and reassure our allies, particularly on the eastern flank, as they continue to move troops towards the Ukrainian border. So we don't know what path Putin will obviously take, but NATO is sending, I think, a very clear position and message right now that it will keep the door open diplomacy. We could have another round, we don't know, with the NRC, the NATO-Russia Council, or we will have to grapple with a different decision. In terms of how this all relates to the strategic concept, it's interesting because what we're experiencing right now is a bit of a microcosm of some of the challenges this alliance is going to face in the future. Obviously, when you think about the Russian toolkit, they have conventional military tools where they could move forces into Ukraine. That's one possibility. But as we've seen the Russian playbook over the last decade plus, we know that they also rely on disinformation. We know that they look at energy security as a national security tool. We know that they look at cyber and cyber attacks as another tool in their toolkit. They use acts of intimidation. They fly into NATO airspace. So the alliance in this moment, as it is simultaneously dealing with the Russia-Ukraine situation and preparing to write a new strategic concept, will be seeing the alliance tackle a variety of challenges in the future: cyber attacks, disinformation, hybrid threats. All of that becomes very real in what we're doing now and could be part of the strategic concept.
Let's not forget nuclear, because 10 years ago, the last strategic concept, you had the INF in place, and you don't today.
Exactly.
So that's something, I mean, you're going to have to look at nuclear policy and the strategic concept as the last one did.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at a whole array of new issues. Obviously, you can't cover every single thing. We don't have a crystal ball. It's hard to predict what the world will look like. But I think the bottom line is NATO allies feel that this particular moment is competitive, it's unstable, and we have to be prepared to take on a whole array of new challenges.
Yeah, perhaps you actually have laid out in front of you. You've been just given, a lot of good ideas about what you need to think about for the next 10 years. I mean, perhaps more than even 5 years ago you would have seen, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's quite remarkable in terms of how the world has changed just in the last couple of years. But what's really impressive about this alliance, and I think sometimes we don't give enough credit to NATO where it's deserved, it's its ability to adapt. And we've seen this alliance since the fall of the wall continually take on new challenges while maintaining the focus on defense and deterrence. And that's a very unique attribute. And that's why I have confidence that we're going to produce a strategic concept that's relevant and will help us address emerging challenges, the challenges of tomorrow.
You've been a NATO scholar for a long time. So let me just ask, because I don't know, how do you actually go about drafting this where you think, okay, it will not reflect the tone of today necessarily? So just explain to me how that works, because, okay, everybody's really worried and nervous right now, but you're writing something that 10 years from now, you don't want it to look like it was written today. I mean, right? It needs to last.
Sure. I mean, and I think we're all pretty clear-eyed about that timing challenge, but it's a very methodical process. We've started by holding a variety of meetings among allies to take on specific challenges that the alliance might be facing in the future. And then we will begin the nitty-gritty work of actually drafting it and negotiating it later this spring. I think there will be differences. There'll be, some debates across the alliance, but I think we all appreciate that it needs to be forward-looking and modern and different from the one from 10 years ago, and yet it can't be trapped in this week or today. So you'll see an emphasis on countries like Russia and China, no doubt, but the good thing about the strategic concept is it doesn't get so detailed as to pull you into one particular situation.
When you look at the one from 10 years ago, do you look and think, we should have seen some of these things coming?
Well, of course it's hard. In hindsight, it's always interesting to go back and read them. But in that moment, it was also pretty cutting edge. So
it was?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, given what its original mission was during the Cold War, so if you compare it and you keep going back, each iteration is modernized. But yeah, of course, if you look at it now, you feel like, wow, we're really in a very different world.
Yeah, I don't want to look at my writing from the last 10 years either. So, okay, I'm going to turn now to Ian. Ian, are these the strategies, are these the priorities also that you believe need to be included in the next 10-year concept? And I know that you're a specialist on the Med, on NATO's attention to the Mediterranean. I mean, do we need to make sure that this is more highly represented now than it was in 2010?
Well, look, Teri, thank you very much. And first of all, let me say thank you very much to our friends at US NATO and also to all of you for being here on behalf of GMF. It's really great to have this conversation. And I think that's part of what's exciting and useful about this is actually having these strategic conversations. You know, redoing the strategic concept, even though it's a fairly general document, actually gets everybody thinking about these problems in a serious way. And of course, we also have things happening in the world right now that concentrate the mind. So those two things together make this an interesting conversation to have. I mean, I agree very much with what Ambassador Smith, Julie, if I may, has said. I think, look, you know, the core tasks, I think, remain relevant. You know, collective defense and crisis management and cooperative security. But what's the mix? What's the mix? What are the instruments? And that's the thing that you have to work out. You know, just a couple of things. I think, first of all, you know, what we're seeing now with Ukraine unfolding, I mean, we're not going back to a calmer relationship with Russia, as much as in my view. I mean, as much as one wants diplomacy to succeed in this, and it may succeed in managing this crisis, the structural relationship with Russia is not going to turn benign anytime soon. And so you have to deal with that kind of need for a high-intensity collective defense. That's going to be with us, I think, for a long time. I hope not, but I think it's going to be with us. And it's not just the East. Of course, it's focused in the East, and that's an old NATO mission, and a relevant one, but it's also in the South, as you say, and it's going to be about Russia in the South, too, right? Not just crisis management. It'll be about Russia, very present, even in places like Africa now. China, the alliance is going to have to deal with China, long conversation there. But, you know, there is this progressive shift, especially in US strategic attention to China. But how rapid? We don't, you know, we just don't know. Something could, rather like the crisis in Ukraine, something could happen in Taiwan or South China Sea next week that would cause a very rapid shift. And, you know, finally, you know, as Julie said, you know, there's this whole wider agenda of, you know, from climate to cyber to resilience, as people are speaking about it. And, you know, if you're going to think about resilience, then I think, I'm going to leave this to Christian to talk about, but, you know, you got to think about the defense spending thing in a slightly different way. I mean, if you've got a wider set of concerns about hardening society, you know, what do you count in that spending? We'll have to see about that. But, you know, that's just a long way of saying I very much agree with the sort of outline that Julie left us with.
And will they get into that much detail in this document, how the spending balance could be changed?
I think there will be some language about this. Julie would have a better sense of what's likely. I mean, obviously, this is a very political topic inside the alliance. That's an important point, too. I think, you know, one of the people sometimes forget that it's not just a military alliance, it's a political military alliance in an important way. And NATO should be the place where these big picture issues are discussed, more centrally maybe than it's been at times in the past, in my view.
I think that's changed even.
I think, no, it has. Well, there's nothing like crises to actually force that, right?
Part of this, and if we're looking at a different level of ambition for this alliance, we have to make sure that the resourcing is there to match that level of ambition, and that's going to be one of the challenges going forward. Certainly something that the United States wants to focus on.
Yes, we always hear that finance ministers should be invited to the NATO ministerials, right? Because everybody has to go back out and convince their finance ministries to spend this way.
That's right.
So that might be something they talk about. I doubt it will be included, but let me get some opening remarks now from Tania. And I've been watching Tania as a speaker on NATO issues now for quite a while. And the first time that I really heard you talk about the priorities of people in the younger generation, you're under 30 and young leaders looking at 2030 now. It was remarkable to me that when they asked people of your age, what would be NATO's biggest challenges? It wasn't Russia, it wasn't China, it wasn't spending, it wasn't resilience, it was cyber threats and it was threats from climate. Now, cyber clearly is under NATO's hat, but you know, Secretary General Stoltenberg has tried to do a lot more on climate, on NATO taking a role in reducing emissions, and that's been controversial, even from his own country, Norway. So if those are the priorities of NATO's next leaders, is what we're discussing here today even, you know, sounding important to you?
Well, actually, the event that you're mentioning took place almost exactly 1 year ago, and we presented this baby here to NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, and this is the brainchild of 14 young professionals who came together trying to provide a sober yet still forward-looking analysis of what are exactly these strategic priorities and challenges that NATO is facing, but from the perspective of a millennial that grew up in the Euro-Atlantic space. And, you know, besides being known for our avid avocado eating habits or lack of access to the housing market, our understanding of our security needs in our strategic environment, if you will, I think were shaped by at least 3 key factors. The first is that we were brought up in the post-Cold War era, witnessing or either aspiring to the freedoms and protective umbrellas that the EU and NATO were providing.
Your countries were members already. That wasn't a challenge.
I grew up through that. I'm Romanian. I grew up witnessing that exact transition. So I'm speaking also from direct experience. The second is that we grew up witnessing firsthand the impact of digitalization and interconnectedness on our lives. And the third aspect is that we grew up in the backdrop of a lot of formative events, from the invasion of Iraq to the rise of jihadist attacks on our soil, to the war in Afghanistan, the war in Syria, but also, as you say, the unfolding of climate change and the annexation of Crimea. We lived through that as well. And each of these had a distinct role in shaping our understanding of our security needs. So I wanted to say this to contextualize a bit our work in this NATO 2030 report, which is called Embrace the Change, Guard the Values. So this is what I want to focus on today, to give you a flavor of what changes we would like NATO to see embrace, and then what are some of the things that we want NATO to guard. And I can give 4 examples of each. First, on the changes. I mean, it's a cliche by now to say, I think, just how much our security environment has changed. That's already been mentioned, from changing power configurations to borderless and under the threshold threats that we're talking about in the context of resilience. But it's clear that NATO has to be able to effectively multitask and deal with these threats in a simultaneous manner. So let me mention some key elements for adaptation. The first one that I wanted to mention is that we recommended that NATO become a resilience pathfinder. This means doing much more to boost both national as well as alliance-wide resilience, from everything like societal resilience, democratic resilience, but also, of course, across the defense spectrum. And here we can go into the discussion on protecting critical infrastructures and other aspects. The second was that we recommended a much more strategic use of partnerships. And here I may be biased or not, but I do think profoundly that the EU-NATO partnership deserves special attention. And this is for 3 very quick reasons. The EU has continued to bring solid defense contributions that are relevant for NATO and strengthen NATO. The second is that when we talk about resilience in particular, NATO needs the EU as much as the EU needs NATO, because the EU has a bunch of legal, regulatory, budgetary instruments that are very useful in this context, not to talk about crisis management, maritime security, tech capabilities, and others. And the third is because the EU is also undergoing its own strategic reflection, setting a vision and concrete goals in the next 5 to 10 years. And that does have an impact on NATO as well, and should be constructed much more coherently, I think, than it was done in the past. And I wanted to zoom into these because they touch upon, I think, all of the issues that I mentioned, and I will mention still. But coming back to the changes, yeah, very quickly. The third recommendation that I wanted to highlight is that we recommended a full mainstreaming of climate change considerations within NATO. And I can go into that a little bit in the Q&A if there's an interest. The fourth one that I wanted to highlight is that we suggested that NATO establish some sort of a defense tech accelerator, which we called NATO Strive. In the end, NATO didn't end up taking our name, which was a bit sad because we did brainstorm a lot about that. But we did see this crystallize a bit more with the Diana initiative. That was more about the changes. And some of the things that we wanted NATO to guard was, first of all, this 360-degree approach, then to keep a focus on the Euro-Atlantic mandate while keeping a global mindset. We wanted NATO to very much focus on guarding its values, and because that's where we need to lead by example. And there we suggested, for example, a written values pledge. among other things. And the last thing I'll mention, we wanted to emphasize that we stand by the dual track approach with Russia.
Different from the Washington Treaty, you mean, where values are laid
Yes,
out.
but we thought it's important that allies renew their vows in terms of the values that they stand for, because we have to set an example here. And the more publicly and formally we do it, the better. And on the Russia point, we stand by the dual track approach. And I wanted to mention this because millennials are often faced with this criticism, I think, that, you don't know what Russia's true intentions are. You didn't live through those times. So we are not naive nor unaware about
You're living through some
that.
of those times now.
Yeah. So those were some of the 8 examples that I wanted to give you, but in this report, there are 35 concrete original ideas and proposals that we put forward precisely to feed into the new strategic concept.
And there has been more attention to climate change with this new center being established in Canada. So there has been movement on that, perhaps not as quickly as we'd like or as comprehensively, but I mean, this is no longer non-existent in NATO's vocabulary.
No, absolutely. And you said it yourself, Secretary General Stoltenberg did a lot of work doing that. What we recommended was also thinking maybe if it would be useful to set up some sort of special task force within NATO to consolidate this effort, maybe appointing a special representative to be as a focal point in as regards climate considerations, but also to think through incentives for allies to not only decrease military carbon emissions, but also look at possible sustainable technologies that they can invest on that are much more climate friendly, yet keep operational efficiency, as we like to say.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Tania. And I hope we can have more events where we go more into these ideas, because they're quite innovative. And now we come to Christian, who, as has already been previewed, has to talk about resources. I'm German Council on Foreign Relations. No, but Christian, you write about this a lot. You think about it a lot. Now you have to talk about it with us. Very ambitious programs. How are we going to pay for this? And if there is a difference, if there is a rethink of how NATO allies may contribute resources, not just the dreaded toxic, as it's called in Germany, toxic 2%. Talk about what can we do in the next 10 years? What can NATO do in the next 10 years? How do we fund it?
Yeah, thanks, Teri, and also thanks to GMF and the US mission for the invitation. It's great to be back and see so many friends. That makes it easier to talk about the toxic topics. The good development, I would say, is that there are new discussions about the scope of the spending, not only coming from Germany, so this is not a scoop. We want to try to just water down criteria, but the discussion is about if we go through all the longer going list of challenges, climate, tech, etc., you always need to put a tag behind it, which says this costs X million dollars. Does it mean that we can widen the scope for defense spending, but that also tap into different money? Or do we kind of, then becomes very technical, do we change the metrics of calculations, etc., at the end of the day, it's about the, and therefore the strategic concept is the important starting point. It is the political consensus that these things fall under NATO scope, that climate change falls under NATO scope, that technology development falls under NATO scope, and therefore NATO needs to invest into these things. I would say yes, definitely. And I can say now, kind of highlighting the G in the German Council on Foreign Relations, this is of course something with the current government or with the new government. You will find many more friends on these things than you would have found before. Not only because it's not because of Swabian house mothers want to keep their money. It is about the overlap of security conceptions of, for example, the Green Party, but possibly also the Social Democrats, and the security environment as it is currently sketched out in the discussions about the NATO concept. So there is a natural overlap, you want to say. Does that lead to 2%? I don't know. Maybe not, but I'm very German by definition. Show me the need for the money, and I will give you the money. That's the approach. You can't go through the 2%. That's something that doesn't work in a Protestant country like mine, I would say. For that reason, that's kind of. But again, the resources need to come with a persuading narrative on these things. And maybe let me throw one idea at least into this as well, picking a little bit on what Tania said. if we can even go beyond the institutional boundaries of these things and say, so how much do we invest into the security of Europe? Because in theory, it's also transatlantic, it's also about the US, but we don't worry about the US for the moment, at least not from the outside. If this is about the security of Europe, what is about the contributions of the Europeans to their security? And that is for the NATO discussion, maybe an important way of thinking about it, because it's NATO and the European Union contributing to the security of Europe, and not NATO equals or the EU equals the security of Europe. It is, however, observable since months or even years again, that we may run into another beauty contest. And that is highly, that should be avoided. Let's try to put it positive. I don't know, it looks like, we are seeing the one corner of Brussels and the other corner of Brussels, trying to be part of that discussion, There should have been discussions among each other instead of about each other.
Table,
exactly, everybody wants a place on the table of the other without having invited to your own table first. Right. Different ways how you put it. EU and NATO, saying this as a German European taxpayer, EU and NATO serve European security and not the other way around. That is the starting point for most of the countries here. So this is about, what's the role of the institutions and what is the interest of the nations in all these things. And I want to have security for me and my family and my country. And whoever is able to provide that can get my money.
Can I ask a quick question for people who don't have the pleasure of knowing how NATO is funded? NATO has its own common funding budget, which is quite small. And then when we talk about the 2%, we should make clear to everyone that is about government spending their own money, 2% of their own GDP on their own resources, which would then be used by NATO if necessary. So are you talking about also a possible shift in how much may go into NATO common funding, that there may be a shift in the balance of how much NATO's own budget is, because right now it's just tiny in comparison.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Teri, because it would kind of build a little bit on the experiences of NATO funding so far, common funding, and people here in NATO will tell you it has been rather effective so far. But maybe also the virtue of small numbers. So you're very effective if you spend small money. Doesn't mean that if you even double it, it becomes huge money. So that could be a way of doing it and experimenting with it, because if you take a look into what the European Commission in some of its areas with common funding can achieve, it is tremendous.
Just avoid a fight, one fight,
There's always fight over money.
Yeah.
That's pretty clear. Everybody wants to have a part of the cake.
But it can move quickly. And if anybody needs to move quickly, it could be NATO headquarters at the moment.
And basically you come back to a discussion about unnecessary duplication. Where can we tap into common funding? And do we always need to discuss it under institutional boundaries? Or can we talk about the effective outcome of these things? And having gone through all the figures and discussions about metrics, I can tell you at the end of the day, if there is a political will, you can have a sit on the table, not publicly possibly, but you can agree among the political leaders and say, okay, we want to at least look into this.
Yeah.
So that would be something in 2022, where EU and NATO are looking into their re-establishment of strategic bases. That would be a welcome signal, I would say, and also build trust into the institutions.
And if a crisis focuses minds, people should be getting pretty focused here, right?
Would be good.
Burden sharing aspects, actually, one of our report's most controversial recommendations is precisely to reform the 2%, to move much more from this framing of burden sharing, but much more towards responsibility sharing, which looks to incorporate many more of the aspects that indeed you pointed that the EU is also very much doing, but that NATO also wants to do now, from resilience to climate change. Because we thought, what other best incentive to have for allies to spend on these matters if it does count as a concrete contribution to our common defense, then including it officially as part of the metric. The advantage of the 2% is, of course, that it's easily understood by our political masters, it's easily understood by our publics, but that doesn't make it necessarily effective and responsive to all the threats in the threat spectrum that NATO itself recognizes.
Well, it's become a negative in Germany. So, I mean, it is not effective. But Julie, you probably won't remember this, but years ago we were in a panel together, and I believe this was off the record, but this is not so. I think this was on background, but. Many defense ministers and foreign ministers were saying they didn't want the country who needed to go back and argue for the money said the 2% was useful. I mean, this has been said in public a million times too, but I remember the first time I heard it was from you. And saying, you know, they're saying don't let up on the 2% because it is the only stick we have to say, but NATO says, but the US says that we need to spend more.
Yeah, it's complicated, but you do hear from some countries, you know, that they may, at the foreign minister and the defense minister level, they may appreciate the need to hit those targets, and they appreciate the fact that NATO came together, particularly in the wake of Russia's attempted annexation of Crimea, and committed in 2014 to hit that target. So what you sometimes hear, because we all experience it back home in our capitals, is that there are different perspectives between finance ministers and defense ministers. And so you do occasionally hear from some countries, look, to have other countries, particularly the United States and the NATO Secretary General, insisting and pushing us to meet this, we can then go back home and try most effectively to make the case that we've got to hit this target. So it depends. In other cases, you hear the opposite. Yeah. You hear from some countries, we've got it. We've got some dynamics back home that are unique and different. It doesn't always help to yell through a bullhorn or a megaphone diplomacy, whatever you want to call it. Please let us handle this behind closed doors and more quietly. Pressure, but not in the public view. And so I think the challenge for the NATO Secretary General and for the United States that's been pushing on this for years and years and years through multiple administrations is trying to get it just right between applying necessary pressure when we think it's helpful and being careful not to overplay our hand to the point where, you know, everybody runs in opposite directions and you're not able to make the right amount of headway. And you've seen that from this administration. You've heard the Biden administration continue to talk about 2% and burden sharing, but I think the perspective is we can get some work done on this, continue to push allies to meet that target, but in a way that's constructive. And that's the emphasis, right?
And will we see a change? I mean, you're the only one who's in the drafting room and sitting on our panel. How much change will we see in this, if any, in the next strategic concept?
Well, I think the 2% target, because it's a commitment that was made, it's got a set deadline towards 2024. Allies are supposed to meet that. We've made tremendous progress.
To aim to move towards.
Aim
could not say
okay. Aim
I
to
was
move
in
towards.
Wales. I remember the argument. Aim
That's
to
why
move
it's good
towards.
to have you here. Yes, a good NATO Nick.
Meet would be great, but it's aim to move towards.
Okay, aim to move towards. But that's what we're aiming for. Let me put that out there. And so we want to continue to work towards that goal. But everyone here is raising important questions about other ways to increase the resourcing debate, to talk about common funding, to talk about NATO's civilian budget, its military budget, to talk about whether or not we're adequately resourced for other sets of challenges on money that could come from other pockets. So we tend to focus on defense spending, but increasingly, as you look at things like cyber, resilience, hybrid challenges, that does bring us into other ministries back in national capitals. So we should have a broader set of conversations about other ways in which countries can apply added resources to these challenges.
Okay, Ian, I think you wanted to come in, and then we're getting tons of questions.
Very brief, because I know you're going to get lots of questions. I mean, look,
have.
I mean, I think it's also very important, you know, to understand that the defense demands have grown. I mean, there's a need for spending here that isn't just political. I mean, yes, every U.S. administration is going to come and look for Europe to spend more and do more. There are different ways to get to that. 2% may be one piece of it. There's also this question of, you know, Europe itself doing more. It's a whole separate debate, this sovereignty, strategic autonomy, whatever you want to call it. I think there's some mythology about that, in my view, in the sense that, look, I think for almost any American administration, if that's a way to get Europe to spend and do more, fine. You know, we don't have to be too orthodox about how you get to that capability. It's going to be very important if the U.S. has to ramp up its capacity in the Indo-Pacific, which is already happening. What are the resources going to be here in Europe to secure Europe? You don't, you know, looking out 10 years, as you're saying, you got to insure against that. And one way is to get Europe to spend more.
Okay, I am going to now, anyone else from the panel? Kristen, did you want to come back in before we hand it out to our Zoom audience? This first question is about deterrence. It says the NATO-Russia Founding Act promotes the notion of reinforcement to defend the eastern flank, not permanent stationing of troops. A constant discussion here. In view of current events, should we expect that the NATO strategic concept will revise this model or logic of deterrence? So I think they're asking if there will be but that would be a revision of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, I think, and I'm not sure that that is something that would be covered in a strategic concept.
Not necessarily. I mean, what we'll have to see, how events unfold in the days and weeks ahead. Again, we're all hoping for de-escalation. We don't know what path Putin will ultimately choose. But depending on how things unfold, of course, that will feed into the debates that are ongoing. But I'm not sure something like that would be part of a strategic concept draft, because again, as we've noted, it's broader about, you're setting a level of ambition and talking about broader strategic challenges. You don't get down into the tactical plans of where you're going to alter course or adjust something or revise. It tends to be a broad, it's long, but still it's strategic and broad.
And it's in the NATO-Russia Founding Act, so it exists in its own document,
Sure,
right?
sure.
Okay, so that's what I would think. Okay, gray zones, again, relevant to today's situation. The final report of a reflection group appointed by the NATO Secretary General recognized that gray zone activity has eroded the traditional boundaries of conflict and, quote, the line between civilians and combatants is being blurred. In view of this evolution, is Article 5 still what it has been established for? Do we need to adapt the notion of Article 5? I mean, that isn't directly related to the strategic concept, but I think that we could definitely talk about how the strategic concept will have to address gray zone threats.
Absolutely. I mean, I just don't think there's any question that that's going to be a key component. And I think what you're going to see is NATO talking about the ways it can work with other sets of actors. So NATO increasingly is looking at, reaching out to the private sector, to NGOs, to academics, just other international and multilateral organizations to take on some of these hybrid challenges, gray zone, resilience. You need different sets of partners. So you'll see a lot of that theme, I think, in the strategic concept.
I think it's a fair question, though, because we talk about this a lot, adapting the notion of Article 5 in what it can be called for. And it has been adapted. It's in cyber, it's in space. Would you see more adaptation of perhaps the level of what threat perception would be needed to call an Article 5? I mean, it is the most solemn pledge that NATO has.
Well, again, back to that, if somebody else wants to chime in, but if back to my kind of original theme of adaptability, this is an alliance that has continued to have tough conversations about the ways in which Article 5 applies to new threats, and it has adopted new domains like space, and it's started to wade into the waters of cyber attacks, and there are still tough conversations to be had. It's more challenging to have a conversation at 30 about cyber attacks than it is than tanks rolling across a border, in which case we know how to respond and what to do. This is an ongoing conversation, but I think you're going to see this added emphasis on these types of challenges in the strategic concept.
Because there's a world between Article 4 and Article 5.
Sure.
Article 4 calling consultations because you perceive a threat, and the next step, there's not like a 4.5. Should there be? Anyone?
No, I think the Article 4 piece actually matters a great deal and is used much more. Article 5 has only been used once in response to September 11th. So, and this was a terrorism risk. This wasn't a threat, challenge, attack. It wasn't a conventional high intensity sort of thing of the kind we're even thinking about today. But the Article 4 piece, I think, really matters if you think about how you reinforce the political piece of NATO. That, NATO should be the place where allies come together to talk about prominent threats that they perceive. And that does happen, of course, but it could happen even more intensively. And many of these things are not going to be, where we would imagine. They could be global, of all kinds. The cyber risks, the use of proxies. I mean, if you even go back to think of what went on during the Cold War, in some ways, the Eastern Front, the Central Front in the Cold War was more stable than what was happening on the periphery. We could be going back to something like that, and NATO, I think, needs to be prepared for that.
We have a question about cyber. obviously with it added as a domain, Article 5 could potentially be invoked by the alliance. There's a lot of discussion about what level would provoke just what response. Will there be more clarity about this, and does there need to be more clarity about this in a new strategic concept? Anyone else? Sorry, I keep looking, I just look at you. You're in the room. You get a pen.
Oh, yeah, okay. No, I mean, look, we, as I said, cyber has been kind of a key feature of the debates here now for quite some time. With every incident, allies are sharing information with each other. We're constantly having conversations. What have we learned? How do you build up resilience? How do you protect your systems? At first, NATO took a very defensive approach. How do we ensure that all of our systems are equipped to not only detect but deter attacks from outside actors? From there, then it's a bigger question about what additional tools do we need in our toolkit? Is there anything from an offensive perspective that this alliance wants to have in its toolkit? So it's an evolving debate. It will definitely be part of the strategic concept. We're learning in real time. We just had an incident in Ukraine, and with each incident, the alliance obviously gets smarter. And that's one of the strengths of this alliance is you can bring these 30 allies together, and we can learn from the Estonians that experienced this in 2008. So many of us have experienced this already. And so bringing those lessons together and then building out the toolkit will remain a key challenge for the alliance.
Tania, bring in what the young leaders thought about this, with cyber as one of their top challenges. At what level would the young leaders tolerate a response by NATO, an Article 5 level response to a cyber attack?
So the way we saw cyber, we had a lot of discussions about this because it's super tricky. If you read the report, you would see a dual track approach to cyber as well.
because you couldn't agree.
No, because on the one hand, of course, we definitely saw the importance of cyber defense and deterrence and having the means to do that and communicating very clearly that you do have the means to respond, including by invoking Article 5. That's the deterrence part. But then we also very much emphasize this aspect of NATO being an ethical norm setter and making or playing a role in promoting, international cyber norms and responsible behavior in cyberspace. So there were these two aspects to it that I would highlight. And in terms of Article 5, I think the baseline is our threat perception, because everything is about consensus in NATO, right? So that's where we have to work on. And that's if our threat perception evolves, and of course it does evolve, Article 5 also evolves, in my view.
That's right. Christian, here's a question that can bring you back in. NATO's strategic concept will come out in parallel with the EU's strategic compass, right? Is there any synchronization? We have a mole on this one. Yeah. Is there any synchronization, and what would Germany like to see on this? Tania.
There's a lot of synchronization. There's a lot of meetings. Now I can tell you I see it from the inside, which is really fascinating. And just last Friday, I took part in the first ever EU-NATO structured dialogue on resilience.
The first ever?
The first, yeah.
One would think that...
Well, there was a lot of planning behind that. So, but then it happened, and it was great. It was great because what I saw was a lot on the plate to work on. As you say in French, il y a beaucoup de pain sur la planche. So a lot to work on together, and a lot of willingness to work on together, and a recognition that what I just said before, that NATO needs the EU as much as the EU needs NATO, and that no one has an interest in having a beauty contest. This was very clear, and it was very reassuring. So I can tell you that everyone has an interest in coordinating this, and you have EU people, all my bosses coming here, debriefing the NAC on what we're doing on the compass. Then we also will expect NATO colleagues to come debrief us on what they're doing on the concept, how that evolves, precisely to try to ensure that they're as coherent as possible, and that we align in our vision and in our goals as well, on how we want to tackle all these threats, to find these synergies, because pockets are limited, forces are limited, single set of forces, we say all the time. We have a single set of budgets as well, so everyone is mindful of that.
So that does lead into you, Christian. How important is this to Germany? As a leader, definitely one of the strongest countries in the EU. So.
Yeah, I mean, on the rhetorical level, Germany is always on. We want to have EU and NATO kind of on eye levels, and we support both organizations in the same way. With a specific situation now, so first of all, it's not coming. The documents don't come up at the same time, which gives opportunities for not synchronization, but at least, putting building blocks into an EU document that can well be received here in NATO, and you also have, in an ideal world, 21 ambassadors who speak in favor of the threat assessment and the capability that the EU wants to put out.
The 21 who are in both organizations.
Because these are the 21 nations who are part of both organizations. So that could be a strong building block if we can live in this best world, so to say. No, I'm more skeptical about the beauty contest, because this is typical institutional life, that heads of institutions are in favor of themselves and not of the other organization. This is social law, if you want to say. That's normal. The question is, can you still moderate between these things? And this is something that, and you hinted to that, this is urgently needed. I mean, we're talking about resilience since 2014. Now we have first conversations. I mean, if this is the speed we are going ahead, it is not the speed of relevance possibly we're going to have. And this needs, then again, leadership from top. This is something which by direction and not by committee can be decided and needs to be directed, especially for the effectiveness of resources, I would say. The interesting thing for the Germans is, as we are great multilateralists and obey what the international institutions say, these are two important steps for our national document. We are going to put out by the end of this year a national security strategy. The EU document and the NATO document will be the ramifications for these documents, because heads of state and government will have signed into it. This makes it important for us to now kind of try and shape the documents as much as this is possible. I guess for the compass it's done. So the EU document, there's nothing you can do, and nobody also wants to spoil the French party on these things. So I guess the French will be very proud of this, and we will all cheer to that. The next step is the NATO concept, which is so important, especially for the defense part, and especially then for Germany, because we are not critical about civilian crisis management, etc. We are critical about the link between politics and defense, and that puts it really back on the spot. And I'm very much looking forward to have, after the summer break, the discussions in Germany about the concept, because then it's on the table.
A huge missed opportunity here. I remember, I mean, of course, Catherine Ashton and Rasmussen spoke about how much more they were going to work together, and then Federica Mogherini and Stoltenberg were friends. They got along very well, great charisma, and still, we're having the first meeting on resilience now. I mean, it's shocking. I realize that planning takes a long time, but.
Planning takes a long time, and there are
Tania.
well-known political issues that also stand in the way, and that can only be solved at the political level.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, those two institutions have come so far, really, over the years. I mean, it used to be that
in terms of
you
talking
couldn't
to each
even be
other?
in the same room, you know? I mean, we had broader questions about even at what level and what would be the mechanics of even a discussion. We had debates years and years ago about when both organizations were operating together in the Balkans, to what extent could they communicate with one another? And now we're in a world where you do see spots around the world where both NATO and the EU, they show up, and we have experience actually on the ground, communicating with each other, working with each other. So I take your point that sometimes it's frustrating because it still takes time to get movement, but compared to where we were 20 years ago, I mean, you think of the late 90s when we were dreaming about some possibility of EU and NATO driving across town and actually having a conversation on some sort of common shared security challenge. It seemed unimaginable at the time. And now we can have those types of meetings on resilience.
And need to be.
If you think about it, if the five of us here try to agree on where to go for dinner tonight, that's not going to be easy. But to work in the EU and in NATO, you have 30 and you have 27, and all of them agree that they need to work more together, and that is progress indeed.
Okay.
If you get more
Not
Europe,
all is
and
lost. Yeah.
If having more Europe in this equation, gets Atlantic partners more capacity and more capability, I think that's absolutely, my own view is that's absolutely fine. But on the EU side at the moment, on the defense question, on the compass, this is largely aspirational. NATO already has concrete capacities and strategies, and there is an asymmetry there. Will it be the same 10 years from now? Perhaps not, might be different, but I think it's worth keeping that in mind. There's an aspirational quality to this compass at the moment.
You're right. This is very important to manage that. I think what is also important is to point out the opportunity that we have. This is a once, not in a lifetime, but once in a 2 or 3 decades opportunity to align and synchronize EU and NATO institutionally and the members and allies thinking about these. We would be, sorry to say so, we would be stupid not doing it because, as I said at the beginning, this is about European security, both organizations serving. So I cannot imagine to not start on the same ground because we're working for the same things here. And therefore, all those who have fear that the European Union would like to become a military actor, they could offer a lot of capacities that you need, be it on the technology and innovation side, be it on the economic side, actually. But all these things are something where you could say this could be a Berlin in reverse, actually, in a modern version. So bring these tools together, that should be the equation. But that all can only, or can better flow if we have, at the end of 2022, a clear and coherent strategic picture of where Europe wants to go with its 2 security organizations. We have 2 security organizations, that's a luxury. We should make most out of it.
That's true, and not always that the documents come up at the same time, because it's largely in the hands of the EU High Rep when they want to revamp the EUs, even though it's 10 years here at NATO, right? So now's the time. I want to get to the question of nuclear, because we haven't discussed that much, and again, there may be more German angle here. In the context of the new strategic concept, do we have to rethink the tenets of nuclear deterrence fundamentally? Again, Julie, as we mentioned briefly, no INF, no restraints at the moment. Talks have largely fallen by the wayside with the Russians on this, but this is something that the US says somehow maintains optimism. Nuclear talks with Russia have not completely deteriorated, even when other aspects of the relationship have. Is that still the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the part of the core piece of this strategic stability dialogue is to focus on arms control issues with Russia. We both recognize, certainly on the US side, I guess I can only talk for our side, but we clearly recognize that there's a need to carry on with that conversation, and there's some hope that we could perhaps make progress in that regard. I think the messaging from both sides has been that Russia and the United States see some prospect to carry on a conversation on those issues. Simultaneously, NATO has also signaled through the recent NATO-Russia Council that it too wants to have a conversation about arms control. Obviously, it affects European security, and there are a lot of open-ended questions. Then that brings us to the strategic concept, which will of course have to reference NATO nuclear policy. I think the position broadly is that as long as there's nuclear weapons, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. Can we have deeper conversations here and with other partners in the world about arms control? Absolutely. But I do feel like in terms of all the things that we could be talking to the Russians about, arms control appears to be an area where there is interest among the allies, among the Russians and the Americans. And so we will try to pursue that. Again, no one has the crystal ball, but that certainly has been a key feature of the engagements to date.
But you're starting from scratch again. No INF, no
right,
open
we're
skies,
missing some of the, right, you're missing, and we've also made clear that Russia's responsible for the fact that we've lost these treaties, arms control agreements that really built up the foundation of our relationship in this space. And so we are in a much different place than we were, say, 10 years ago. So it is a very different type of conversation.
And not in a good way, yeah. Where will the new German government come in on this?
After quite a hard fight in the coalition negotiations, we kept the status quo. So it's deterrence and dialogue, and nuclear is part of it. And it is hammered into the coalition agreement on 3 different points. And I can say everybody has been very happy when that was signed off, because that was something
anyway.
It was very interesting to see. It's necessary sometimes to prevent language to go into documents, to have the right balance of things. So the German government on rhetoric is pretty clear and stands on nuclear deterrence, and by that also on the nuclear sharing side. The proof of the pudding is the procurement of the DCA, of the dual capable aircraft. That's the next as I said, proof that needs to be done quite quickly. So you can see whether Germany delivers or not very early on. And for the rest of the disarmament or arms control talk, you will see Germany kind of, sometimes, overblown ambitions on that. But on the professional political bureaucrats, I think there's a pretty clear line on, if we can do it, we definitely want to do it, but not to the negative side on NATO or on Germany. That's definitely not what we're going to do. If we can get a new INF, yeah, sure, why not? Everybody says it's worse than before. Then let's go into negotiations. Even if we get something that's not perfect, that's fine. However, the idea that you started the question of just to get this straight, fundamentally reviewing in an area of nuclear is something where I get nervous. This is a slow motion tango. If you move too fast on this, you will lose your partner, and you don't want to lose a partner in nuclear things. So it's something where you gradually can change possibly things. And also you have more dancers in the room than you had before. That also comes into this game. It's no longer Russia. It's the Chinese who are getting into this. We have more countries who are into nuclear proliferation. We will see a new debate about nuclear energy coming up with new kind of spiral offs of, okay, what does that mean for proliferation risks here and there? So there is something where I guess the whole kind of frame we are looking into needs to be rethought, possibly yes. And part of that gradually going into the language of how do we see NATO deterrence and its nuclear bit evolving in the future. But something where I'm more on the stability side and moving slowly but surely, saying, let's come on, let's rush out of it. That's something in nuclear you don't do.
And again, when you're having to look ahead 10 years, you hope this will change quickly, but you have to write something that will still make sense in 10 years.
Exactly.
Now, we only have about 5 minutes left, and so I want to ask the question that was not in the last strategic concept, China. I don't want us to be remiss in not mentioning it, so I'm just going to ask each of you to give me your views, starting with you, Tania. This was not a question that came up a lot in your discussions with, or at least the ones that I could watch with the young leaders. And maybe your generation doesn't feel that it's the challenge that older generations do. Where would you think that NATO's strategic concept needs to lay things out on China?
I definitely wouldn't say it's not a challenge. It's just an extremely complex challenge that NATO has to figure out how it can deal with, if it has the right instruments to deal with that, and if it doesn't, what kind of partnerships does it need to be able to deal with that in a coherent way. Just like in dealing with Russia, unity is our best deterrence. So this is a bit the frame in which we saw the relationship with China as well, and just it definitely needs much more attention. And you cannot just have a military approach to China. This is why I mentioned in the beginning that we think NATO should maintain its Euro-Atlantic mandate, while very much keeping a global mindset, because it's not about, Stoltenberg says this all the time, it's not about NATO going to Asia or to China, it's China coming here. So this, I think, should be the focus on how you can increase your resilience to all of the things and all of the involvements that we see China, or all of the areas in which we see China dipping its toes in. And you need partners to do that.
And Ian, just very
Look,
quickly.
I mean, part of this is about what NATO can and should say about China and dealing with China, but part of it is simply how NATO will be affected by, sort of growing strategic attention to China from the United States above all, and how NATO should compensate for that in the European theater. I mean, this is not a simple question. It would be much easier to answer that question if we had a benign relationship with Russia at the moment, but of course we don't. Right. So that's a very, very tricky one. And above all, for American strategy, this is simply not going away. So I don't think you can sort of put this aside and say it's not relevant. Is NATO the key actor in that regard? Probably not. Is it affected by what happens in that sphere? Absolutely.
Well, look, NATO has had some really important discussions on China over the last couple of years. It conducted its first review in 2019, and of course talked about how China is challenging the rules-based order at the summit last summer. I think there needs to be ongoing discussions across the alliance about the challenges we face, how it is presenting an alternative model. It is working to undermine the rules-based order. NATO's part of that order. And back to what you were saying, Tania, just understanding what China is doing on the European continent in terms of the investments it's making and how that can present vulnerabilities for the alliance, for our collective security. So yes, building resilience, having tougher conversations about what China is doing, and working with other organizations and partners to address that challenge.
And again, the EU comes in very handy here because they can check the prospective purchases of outside actors.
Sure,
here. So,
sure.
Christian, your last word on China?
I think you made the brilliant point on these things. It's especially about NATO being affected by China, especially here. And that the tricky question, I'm very happy that we don't have to solve it, that the time is over, is how do you plan this on a decade time frame with regard to, I guess, not highly granular capabilities, potential scenarios where the US is bound and Europe is basically back to what some people want, European autonomy, in a certain way. So we have to protect our own because the Americans cannot come. And interestingly, I mean, this week, it's the US who is putting 8,000 soldiers on higher alert. So it seems that at least in some corners of Europe, we still think we need some help from the other side of the Atlantic. So if we, and I guess the US would be happy, if we get more European pillar in NATO, that would be tremendously helpful for the security of NATO, of the Europeans, and of the Americans.
Thank you very much. Very interesting days, dangerous days. Fascinating to watch from a perspective of NATO policy and the European Union as well. I would like to very much thank those of you joining us from around the world, and I'm going to hand it over to Ian for the last word.
Okay, well, it's a very simple last word, which is simply thank you. It's wonderful to have this cooperation with the U.S. mission to NATO. We're really grateful for that, Julie. It's lovely to see you again. Thanks to everyone, to Tania, to Christian, above all to you, Teri, for moderating this conversation. And allow me also a thanks to my colleagues at GMF who have put all of this together in the background, to Bruno and to Jordan, and Julianne. Many, many thanks. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. Good to have you with us. Look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.